Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 3, Episode 2. Today I'm speaking with Kelley Harrell, who is an animist, author, death walker, and death doula. Kelley is deeply connected to the Tuscarora Wakan and Sisypha lands. Through soul intent arts, she has guided others in ethically building thriving spiritual paths for over 25 years. Her nature-based approach centers on soul tending through the Elder Firth arc, runes, animism, ancestor tending, and death work. We'll be talking about her new book, From Elder to Ancestor, Nature Kinship for All Seasons of Life, which is available for sale now. I will now take you to my conversation with Kelley Harrell. Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. Today I'm speaking with Kelley Harrell, who is an animist, author, deathwalker, podcaster, and death doula. Kelley, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, Dean.
I'm really happy to have you on the program, and I'm so happy to be talking to you. These questions that I have for you, I read after reading information and looking through your book. I just really have been very excited to talk to somebody as multifaceted as you. Can you share a little bit about where you grew up and how it shaped your spiritual journey?
I grew up in eastern North Carolina. It's Tuscarora, Wakan land. It's by the Neuse River. We had 4 seasons. I don't know if we still do. We had 4 seasons. I was outside when I wasn't sleeping, and I always had my hands in the dirt. Um, my summers were spent in the Appalachians in North Carolina with the other half of my family. I grew up with an Appalachian grandfather who was absolutely an animist. It's where I learned that we have a responsibility to everything, that we're in relationship with everything. He probably never knew that word. I don't know, but that was the way he moved in the world, and that's who taught me and my sister also. And one of the most formative things about my childhood was seeing the dead. I knew that was what it was, like really early on. I don't know why it was, I still don't. But somewhere around the age of maybe 7 or 8, I saw this Disney movie called Child of Glass Disney, like of all things. And it was about a little boy who was in that same age range who started seeing the ghost of a little girl in that same age range and realized that she needed help to be able to move on. And that was the first point that I understood there is a reason that I see dead people. And I kind of aligned all the studies that I possibly could, which meant nothing at the time in rural North Carolina. There wasn't a lot to study, but that was it for me. That was the point that I understood that was part of what I was going to do here.
Your work blends animism, death work, and Norse traditions. How did these seemingly disparate paths come together to form Soul Intent Arts? And can you talk a little bit about what Soul Intent Arts is?
Sure. There's also some Celtic flair, a little bit of druidry in there also, and it does sound like a lot. And it took a long time for me to understand what I was doing, what path I was walking. I tried on a lot of different things, and it really, for me, settled out to being ancestral as much as it could be, as much as we know about what our ancestors' spiritual paths would have looked like, but partially to honor those different traditions in my lineage and to be respectful of the ground that I'm on. I mean, I'm ultimately a European diaspora white person on Turtle Island, a place that, while I love it and I'm in deep relationship with the ecosystem, somebody else was in deeper relationship with it for thousands of years before anybody who looks like me got here. So mostly my path has just been respecting my ancestral traditions as much as possible, and the land, the spirits of the land where I live, and the people who still steward that land as much as possible. And that is ultimately what has shaped soul intent arts. That is my practice. I've worked with others for almost 30 years to help them figure out how to do that same thing. Like, how do you arrive at your cosmology, your spiritual path in a way that's true to you and true to your lineage, but is respectful of the land and the spirits where you live, the people who steward the land where you live. And that's, I think, a pretty big deal in American settler culture. It's not easy to do.
I wanted to ask you a question, and I know that we prepped a little bit with questions ahead of time, but as you've been talking, this kind of question popped into my head. So I want to throw it out and see if it works for you. You know, I've read a lot of articles recently where people talk about paganism as a monolith, and we oftentimes focus heavily on the traditions of Europe and stuff. But I've been talking increasing with people on the podcast who have been part of American traditions. And while they have some um, relevance to European traditions, they also have very ingrained American practices. Is that something you can talk about a little bit and how it's affected your life? Because we don't all uniformly have that experience. Like many of us who grew up, like, say, the suburbs of California, don't really have that. We don't have anything like that. What has it been like for you?
Challenging, really challenging. And weeding out what of the disparate avenues of my family were actual traditions that our family, like, each different side kind of honored, but at the same time, where are the Christian overtones in that? Because all sides of my family were really different flavors and sometimes did not get along because of
Yeah.
that, different flavors of Christianity. And trying to understand, what to extract from that, that is something that I can bring forward in a truthful way and in an ethical way. And at the same time, like, making some really hard decisions about stuff that I can't bring forward, but I have to accept it as having been part of my past, part of stuff I used to do and didn't have a whole lot of choice about. I think that it's a good question to ask, and I think that, you know, everybody's going to have a different answer for that because we get here a different way.
Does it ever frustrate you when you see writers speak of paganism or witchcraft as a larger umbrella term as a monolith? Because apparently, I mean, from the people I've talked to, and one of the emphasis on the podcast that I'm doing is that there's so many different takes on the what we consider the same thing that there really can't be any monolithic kind of interpretation of this. How do you feel about it when you see articles that basically just take a nod to Crowley or whatever or Wicca and they don't talk about anything else?
I think that paganism has been made monolithic. I
Yeah.
don't think that what we would discuss as indigenous roots of Europe, which is it's a weird phrase to come out of the mouth of an American person. And I know that
Yes.
lands strangely for my European pagan friends. But it's a conversation that's happening widely right now. And I really appreciate that because I would have appreciated it 40 years ago to have had that conversation, and it wasn't to be had.
Yeah.
So I don't experience it as being monolithic, but it has been made monolithic. And I think that's problematic for people who do ancestral work in particular. It makes it even more challenging. And I think it makes it hard for people who have held down indigenous traditions in Europe. There are some people that I'm in close contact with, particularly with indigenous Irish traditions, who they just don't have good things to say about where modern paganism has gone in terms of what we're calling a monolithic umbrella. They're like, no, you took that.
Yeah.
And I think we have to pay attention to it. We have to listen to that.
Absolutely. You drew much of your work from the runes. Can we talk about that and animism? How did they kind of fall together for you, and how did they inform your approach to death work?
I think largely the runes teach me how to live, which means they're also teaching me how to die. Like one of the questions I get the most is, what do you mean when you say we die well? Does that mean we don't die well if we don't do certain things? Or, what does any of that mean? And the short answer is how we live is how we die. And one of the challenges that I've had in understanding my relationship to, I guess, my flavor of paganism is where do I get the discipline from? Because I didn't have like a structured, taught approach. I did with Druidry. Like I've completed Druidic studies, I've completed a lot of different studies, but they kind of amalgamate into this person who needed a track. Like I needed some discipline, I needed some boundaries for what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I feel like the runes are part of what gave me that. I mean, I don't feel like I can ignore the spiritual path of my ancestors. And so, even the ones I'm not excited about, the ones who did horrible things, and we have to honor that spiritual path of the land that we stand on, and that can be a conflict. I mean, I live in the South. I have no doubt that my ancestors here didn't do great things. And so, like, being able to find the place where I can stand in all of that and hold it, the runes have helped me do that. And showing up here as an animist helps me stay accountable to that. There's huge responsibility in an animistic perspective. If you move with the awareness that everything is alive, that you're in relationship with everything, that means you have a responsibility to everything. And there's a continual examination of how do I move in a way that blesses me and my community. Like the runes help me do that ongoing.
I want to ask you next, how does, and I'm hoping I pronounce this correctly, Seder and Druidry influence your work at Soul Intent Arts?
Without question, Druidry gave me the discipline that I needed. Um, so I came to my soul work. Like, how do you figure out? You see dead people, so what? What do you do with that? As a kid in the 80s, what does that mean? And as a young adult in the 90s, where do you go to learn how to do something with that? Pagan culture was not having that conversation at the time. And I've seen a lot of like snarky conversation between the whole new age thing, which is like a huge umbrella of stuff also, and what we consider modern pagan culture. But the reality is, in my experience of 90s paganism was not having conversations about how you do better. Like it was all about how to do a spell or how to do a ritual, all good things, all wonderful things, but there wasn't a bigger context for what those things are fitting into. And that's what I needed to understand in that age range. And I wasn't getting it. I started my studies with a local lady who identified as a shaman. And where she had her education was at least largely through the Foundation for Shamanic Studies. And so that was the lens that I started learning under what to do with these things that are coming to me, these perspectives that I need to do something with. And even that gave me no parameters. Like I realize now it couldn't have. It wasn't created to give me parameters. That's a whole other conversation. But what did was my Druidic study, the capacity to be still with myself and have mindfulness, to be still with the space around me, and not make the space around me be me or be through my perspective, but to learn how to have the mindfulness to kind of step away from whatever being me is and just be us in a space. That is what Druidry gave me. Seder absolutely feels like home for me in terms of how I move in the world spiritually, how I connect with lore and context to kind of look backward ancestrally and decide how I'm going forward. And it definitely made bells go off in my cosmology and in my ecosystem, oddly enough. But strangely, I don't teach either one of those things. I don't teach Druidry. I don't teach Seder. There are people who are much more qualified, and I feel culturally affiliated with what those lands and those cultures have to offer that I don't feel like is for me to embody. They're absolutely my personal path. They inform me, but I don't teach them through soul intent arts. And I feel like the best thing that I can offer people, given the amalgamation of the things that I've studied and have interest in and are my heart song, for lack of a better word, is to teach them how to do that. How do you draw on these seemingly disparate pieces of a cosmology, of ancestry, of literally where you stand, the nature spirits where you live, and how do you manage to get your calling done with all of that walking with you?
I want to ask next about what you do when you help guide clients in building a spiritual path. And I want to ask a little bit about this just personally. I feel like sometimes people don't talk about this topic enough. Building a spiritual path is not something that is easy, but I feel like we don't talk about how difficult it can be sometimes, or at least for some of us it is. Can you elaborate a little bit on the practice for ethical and personal growth in helping build a spiritual practice?
I love that you're asking that. Um, a conversation that I have over and over with clients who come to just kind of have one-on-one sessions and with students that I work with and mentor. This is hard. You're asking a question about a conversation that may not have been had for thousands of years in a particular context, in any given context. And the labor of that is real. The pushback culturally to not have that conversation is real. Not only does it not support us having that conversation, it wants us and actively tries to derail us from having that conversation. So I think it's really important to ask how do you make that happen? And it's challenging because the way I break it down is lots of people come to me because they want to learn shamanism. And I'm like, I can't help you with that. Like,
Yeah.
that's not something I can help you with. It was a challenging experience for me to come to terms with what that education meant and how it has informed me, and to understand what that word means in the world, and what it means for me to use it or not use it. Other people do what they need to do, but people typically come to me because they want to learn the technology of soul tending, of soul work. That is, I know what the medical doctor does, I know what the psychologist does. What does someone who is seeking to do soul healing, soul care, what are those technologies? That's what people come to me to learn. But the thing that they don't understand, and it took me a long time to understand, I don't on any level mean I got this right or that I'm still getting it right. But that question is really saying, help me find my cosmology. Help me find the rituals to access that cosmology on any given day, anytime I need to. Help me navigate the experiences that come out of those first two things and stay sane. Help me to figure out, have conversations about who I am and how I move in the world with people who don't give a shit about understanding what that is. All of that at one time is what we're doing when we say we want to learn an animistic path, when we want to learn a soul tending path. And where that really comes like into focus for people in these conversations is when I say, on an indigenous path, you would have started learning those things from day one with a community who shares the same lens, the same experience of how life works and how cosmology works. There goes the dog. And we would have had people helping us so that we're not doing it alone. We would have elders who understood the part that, you absolutely need to do this and you need to do this every day and you should never do that and you should run screaming from this other thing. We don't have any of that. We don't have any of it in this culture. And we are learning all of those things at the same time. Whereas in an indigenous culture, you're learning it over years, you're learning it over a lifetime. And it's hard to get somebody to understand, like they want their shit fixed in an hour. Like
Yes.
they want their
Yeah.
wisdom imparted in an hour. And I do too. I'm not saying that I don't. I want it too. But it doesn't work that way. And in American settler culture, we have that challenge of working through all those pieces and parts. Then comes the grief of realizing we don't have those pieces and parts and how much work it's going to take to get them, and then realizing the system is going to work against us having them.
We have a tradition in America with our schools and in our religion. I was reading the book for school, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which talks about education and how education is learned in America. And they gave examples of different types of learning styles. And one of the things I've seen in religion often in America, I don't know about Europe, I guess that would maybe be a European model too, but, and I can't speak for other countries or cultures, but typically what I've seen is basically you go to church on Sunday, regardless of the faith, somebody tells you these lessons, and then you may have some prayer or Bible kind of thing or other book. And usually like there's this kind of like somebody's talking, you're listening. But it seems to be like in my, a lot of the practices, especially the ones you're talking about, you're more plugged into deity, you're plugged into nature, you're plugged into the universe. Is that kind of a different, I mean, is it hard for people to grasp who have this different take on education and how we learn spirituality and even anything really?
It's really hard.
It's
It's
really hard
really
to kind of
hard.
rewire the brain.
Yeah, because there's no step one, step two, absolute results guaranteed. Like it doesn't work that way. And I that's the way that I teach and hold space for people to come to relationship with what it needs to be for them. And I don't mean it's a free for all, like there are absolutely no, parameters for how things can work. And I feel like that is what my job is when I'm teaching someone, is helping them to decide and hold those parameters so that they can figure out what the pieces and parts of their path are. But it's really hard to put that forward. And some people that I work with find it really annoying. They want step one, step two. I do too. I would love to have clearly identifiable, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's what you can expect to come out of that. But I don't think we're there. I don't think
Yeah.
that's where we are anymore. And so, coming back to who's in your cosmology, why are they there? What purpose do they serve? How do you engage them? Those are your rituals. How do you engage them? And to what end are you engaging them? How does that benefit your community? Because it can't all be just for you. How are you bringing that medicine back to your ecosystem? How does that inform your land-based identity? Like that's the way it has to work. And it's hard. It's hard. It's deeply self-responsible work, ecosystem responsible work.
I want to ask you about soul tending and how do you incorporate it into your work?
Soul tending is a phrasing that I had to do a lot of letting go of to arrive at. I mean, I'm sure I've not originated that, but my relationship to it came from really struggling with the word shaman and the various countless job descriptions that fit under that term, whether they should or should not. That's how in American culture we've kind of come to ascribe that term or that title of shaman. And I am connected with Northern tradition people and Sami people who are like, that term is not up for grabs. It isn't. It never was. And we need it to come back home now. And so I'm all good with that. And it prompted me to sit down and say, well, what do I really do? Like what are the verbs? What do I verb in this work on a regular basis? And what would that have been ancestrally? None of those words worked either because they aren't inclusive of what this land's experience is. And so I just ended up coming back to the verb of what I do. And it's also informed by me being disabled and chronically ill. Some things don't heal. Like they don't. They don't heal in the sense of curing. And so I had to really come to personal terms with what that means for still having a viable life, for still feeling like I'm called to do something that leaves it better here than I found it. And the verb tending is what came up on a personal score, on a practice score, over and over. And for me, that will always be at a soul level. And so soul tending is what I came back with. And that is the approaches that are how do we treat the soul sources of the dynamics in our lives that are not what we want them to be for whatever reason. So it could be the technology that is soul retrieval. It could be death walking or ancestor work, shadow work, any of those things.
I want to talk a little bit about death work and your work with that. Now, death in our culture is something I find that I feel like we kind of avoid it. We don't really talk about it. Our funerals tend to be very much like sweeping the whole death process under the rug. We tend to have very sanitized views of death, or we just don't even address it at all, I feel. So what role does a death doula and death walker play in supporting individuals and families? And can you explain a little bit what the term death doula means?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking. Death doulas help people and their families be connected to the resources that they need at death. And I mean, it is sort of like a death social worker, a death midwife is a phrase that I see often. And there are some really, really good programs and individuals doing really groundbreaking teaching in death doula work. And so it is like at its literal level sitting the bedside. It is truly being spontaneously available to sit the bedside of someone who's dying and just help them not be alone, and help, whatever needs are on the end of the family to meet. That is what we typically mean when we hear people say death doula. What I discovered, so like the Death Walker thing has been with me since as far back as I remember being in existence. And that for me is helping people to cross over and not just leave the human realm and move on to whatever comes next, but to do it in a way that they aren't leaving baggage, to help them reconcile their trauma, their unexpressed, whatever, the unfinished business, so that when they leave, they are fully ready for whatever the next thing is. And I don't know what the next thing is. All I know is my job is to help them get to that point. I had this great plan in my head that I would crosswalk those identities and those jobs of death doula and death walker. And my ideal was to be able to do the spiritual part of it for people where they needed it, and to also like get the phone call in the middle of the night and be able to sit with somebody. But what I realized halfway through my training was my disability and my health doesn't have space for that kind of spontaneity. And so I kind of finished the rest of my death doula training grieving that that part probably wasn't going to work for me, but also really coming back home to what I help people do is be finished spiritually when they leave here. I help the terminally ill who know that they have a certain amount of time left and they want to be able to understand what their cosmology is so that they can have mindfulness in as much as possible in their last hours to be able to access their allies, their loved ones through that cosmology, to be able to navigate themselves however they need to. And in some cases, the death walking part also includes working with the family. It can be like ideally, we hope we have these conversations while everybody's well. We hope, everybody's at the table and they're able to communicate what they want to have happen at the point of death in terms of their funerals, in terms of their rites of death, but also things like commendation of the elder of the family. It's not just a title that passes to the next oldest child or whatever. It's an energetic thing. It is an energetic aspect of what has to happen when the body is put to rest. And so, doing that part of the ceremonial death rite is what I often help the remaining family do because they didn't have those conversations. They didn't have these super intimate discussions around what everybody needs to happen spiritually at the point of death. So, I guess, to some degree, I still have hope of being able to cross those streams, and I do some of the work that death doulas do, but it's looking a lot different than I planned for it.
How do you prepare for this? Because it seems like it would be very difficult to me, especially as we live, I guess, in a culture that doesn't usually really discuss death. Like I've dealt with death recently in the last year, and the whole thing ends up being very awkward for all parties, including the person dying, usually because we don't know how to talk about it. I think often I find, as much as I've read about death studies, I still am all thumbs when I'm talking to somebody who's dying or dealing with people that are bereaved. And so, how difficult was this to learn? I mean, it must have been a real tough row to hoe, I think.
It wasn't for me, and I don't know why. I don't know
Hmm.
why, but I'm able to hold that space. And I also think it's important to say that not everybody wants to hold that space. Not
Right.
everybody is cut out for it, even if you're forced into it, with dealing with a loved one who's moving on. Like, not we're not all cut out to sit in that space, and that's, I think, why the role of death doula is super important, because they can make the phone calls that are hard to make. They can take over some of the sitting, some of the conversation that needs to happen, some of the witnessing that needs to happen. I mean, I can't advocate enough for looking for a death doula when you need one. And
Right.
there are directories and online where you can find them. But that is their role. They fill the gaps that our culture doesn't teach us are going to be there at death. And none of our medical facilities are equipped for that. That's not what they
Yeah.
do. And we historically reach to, ER when we think someone is dying. We reach out to our medical care, and even hospice often doesn't address the spiritual needs of people who are not Christian. So, if anybody is thinking they want to be a death doula and they are pagan, they are needed. They're deeply needed.
I find it's a term I'm becoming more aware of. I don't think I heard about it a few years ago. That being said, the mainstream population, like when you walk into a hospital or a hospice, although maybe a hospice would be a little easier. Let's say you walk into a home or a hospital. Do people always know what it is? How do you explain yourself? Is that tough?
No, people don't know what it is. And frankly, even some hospice facilities, they don't have somebody doing that job. And now that it has become a more recognized role and job, a lot of people who work in hospice have expressed kind of being threatened by that, but they're different roles. Like, the death doulas don't do the medical part. Some death doulas may be nurses, like they may have the credentialing that allows them to do other aspects of it, but it's a role. It's, if you look at it like a social worker, as someone whose job is to connect you with the pieces and parts that help you meet a need, like, that is what they do. This person has spent their time studying how to connect people with the resources they're going to need at their death or the death of a loved one. And Most of that seems to happen for people by going to hospice places or hospitals and volunteering. Like that's how they get their initial, I guess, expertise out and let people know what they do and kind of educate by doing. And a lot of people end up being hired to do that job by places who help people die. And to that end, there are a lot more organic places that are, I don't even know what you would call it, but the conscious death, like places where people go. They have hospice overtones, and they have, for legal reasons, they have someone there who can meet that legal need of watching over the person medically, but the focus of the place is conscious death, so
Yeah.
that there's a doula present there, those needs are being met, the loved ones have a place to sleep, every few hours. And like, I think that's beautiful. There's one in North Carolina that is like, they only have room for so many beds and they stay full. Like, that's something that's happening in different places now.
Can we talk a little bit about ancestral tending, and the importance of this and how to guide people in connecting with their ancestors?
It's huge, right? It's like the new part of the conversation in a lot of pagan culture. Ancestor tending, again, for me, kind of comes from this place of, it's not something that I do or change, but I watch over it and I continue to tend these relationships. What that means for me is either acting on behalf of someone, like a client comes to me and says, I have this pattern that just keeps playing out. I've done the medical, I've done the nutrition, I've done the yoga, I've done all the stuff. I pray all the time. It just doesn't let go. My response to that is, then it isn't originating with you. If you're doing all the things and it shifts a little bit, but then it creeps back in, doesn't shift at all, or it shifts a little but not enough, it's because it isn't originating with you. And that's where we need to start looking at ancestor patterns, like how things move through the family. And it can be curses, it can be possession, it can be all number of things. This can be soul loss, in that this person somewhere down the line was met with an extraordinary situation that they weren't equipped to handle. Like, for whatever reason, they had to make a decision that was a really horrific decision to make, and it stayed with them. And we know none of us get to control how those things mark us. Like, we don't get to decide how we carry it with us, but we do. And that gets carried down. We have a lot of conversation about intergenerational trauma, which is fabulous, but we don't talk about enough what that looks like at a spiritual level. And we carry these things. They come forward in unique ways for each person in the family. And so part of my job is to help people find these sources, find the first time this life dynamic that isn't moving. When is the first time that happened? What's the source of that dynamic? And work through it to release it from the family, and help the person coordinate with whatever dream team members who have skills that I don't have, that help them to support that healing staying in their life, to help it root into their habits and their thought patterns and their beliefs, to move forward without that pattern following them. From a teaching standpoint, I teach people how to help people do that. I teach them how to do that ancestral work, what kind of the boxes need to be ticked, but they get ticked off in the order that is unique to the situation, so that we're eventually chipping away at these collective systems that are troubled, or if not straight up harmful, for whatever reason. And when we each can do that in our own family line, we are changing the systems that keep us down.
Can you talk a little bit about what sets your approach to death work and spiritual guidance and soul intent arts apart from others?
I think that I think foremost, this conversation was not happening in paganism. Like in
No,
90s era paganism, it was not happening. And I
no,
it is one that I made sure I started, like not the starting of, but I made
yeah.
sure that this was going to be part of how we talk about what our spiritual practice is and what it needs to encompass. So that conversation and the fact that we have to each do it our own way. Like if it works out that you get a guidebook and that guidebook for this flavor of paganism works for you, then go at it with your whole heart and your whole truth. What I find is, particularly for people who are more animistic in how they move among the world, there isn't one. And I don't have one to give you. It's not that I have it, but helping people to cull through the pieces and parts of what makes their path whole and functional and benefits their community. Like that is what I feel like sets the work that I do apart from what I see other people doing. And it's all needed. It's all needed.
I want to talk about your book, From Elder to Ancestor. Your book emphasizes nature kinship for becoming a good ancestor. Can you elaborate on this connection?
I think we forget that nature is our ancestor. Like, if first of all, why do we have a word for nature? Like, what does that accomplish by having a word for nature as if humanity is separate? Because we often say humans and nature, like we are nature. Like unraveling that whole semantic and the psychology around the verbiage that separates us from nature, I think is important. So, realizing that nature is our ancestor. We really do come from the ground. We really do come from the trees, the organisms. So, part of that is ancestor work. Part of coming to terms with what hang-ups or triumphs you have around your relationship with nature is part of ancestor work, as far as I'm concerned. They are inextricably related. And I feel like we have to be good allies to nature. And when I say that in myself, it evokes this like save the planet kind of urgency, which is real. But I live here, I live on this land, this ecosystem, which is dramatically different from other ecosystems around the planet that I know nothing about. So we have to kind of dial it in. We have to just be in really close, intimate relationship with our ecosystem, understand what it needs, give it as much as possible, go to the town meetings and stand up for it as much as possible. Like that's part of nature kinship that requires something from us. It is kinship. It's not just, my nature allies serve me. I call on them when I need things. There is reciprocity. And part of
Yeah.
that kinship is how do I take care of my ecosystem? What makes me a good family member to my ecosystem? And when you really start tapping into those conversations, those relationships, they will talk back to you. They will engage you. And it opens up this arena or awareness of what ancestor is that maybe you wouldn't have gotten to just by sticking to the human stuff.
I want to talk about a part of the book. And how does past trauma and shadow work impact the development of the sacred self?
Wow. Um, we all have trauma. Like I would go, I meet people all the time who are like, I've never been through a traumatic experience. And I'm like, first of all, you're standing here in this country and the inability to recognize how things work here can only be like the rooted from privilege. And privilege is kind of being able to say, I don't have trauma. I don't know anybody who doesn't have roots in trauma somehow. And when we have roots in trauma, we invariably have shadow aspects. Um, the Jungian approach of shadow is interesting and informative, but I also find it incomplete, which is a really big thing to say. But what I experience from a soul level, purely looking at shadow, is again, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, anytime we're in a situation where we're like, I have to react and I don't know how to react, and we do what we have to do to deal with the moment, that's a moment where shadow aspects can happen. Like streetwise, it's street smarts. It knows what it has to do to be able to survive, but we invariably grow beyond that. Like we age beyond it. If things are going well, we age beyond it. We mature past that point, but we might still have this ickiness around that experience, this feeling of, why do I freak out in this situation that I'm completely grown and capable of handling? Why am I still freaking out? Exploring shadow parts is one place to look. It's a really good place to look because we all have them. And so being able to like find that shadow part in that moment that had to make the decision it had to make and realize that it's not a bad thing. It creates tension in our present, in our mature, I should be able to handle this self. But the reality is it's wise. It made the decision it needed to make. And it's sort of like a confusion of timelines more than anything else. It's like catching all of you up to the present. And when you can do that, there's a sacred aspect to that shadow. There is wisdom, there is savviness that I always hear people say, you need to kill the ego, you need to kill the shadow, you need to get rid of your shadow. I've never met a part of myself in good faith that I could kill off and be okay and be sane and be functional. Even the ones that aren't quite mature, even the ones that don't handle things well, when we can kind of come to that awareness about ourselves and just look at it with acceptance, not blessing it, like you did great, it was wonderful what you did, but to just be able to say, with the information you had at the time, you did the best you could. There's room for that to evolve into a sacred experience of yourself. And there's room to realize that it always was connected to your sacredness. All of you is connected to your sacredness, whatever that phrasing even means. And so part of what I talk about in the book is what the relationship between these different components is, in the hopes that we can embrace ourselves with a little bit more empathy and compassion.
Kelley, I want to ask you, do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on that you want to talk about?
I always have too many projects, I think. Right? There's a few things coming up.
I think everybody says
um,
that.
right? It's like, so many synapses, so only so much time.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do is a long-term soul tending training that teaches people how to hold animistic awareness through everyday stuff and how to cultivate the relationships with ecosystem that need to be in place so that you have the foundation to do those bigger soul tending skills if you want to. You can just be that you want to learn the everyday part, and that is plenty. So through COVID, I realized that the way that I was doing it, like as a full on 2 year intensive, wasn't working out. People don't have that anymore. Like, we don't have the capacity to just put our heads in something long term and be able to handle life all at the same time. So I'm kind of breaking that down into sort of like components. And a new component of that called the Quest series will be starting in January.
Oh,
Um, and also, this one is one of those things that like whispered to me, and I was like, really? Are you sure? This one is called, I don't even remember the name of it. It's so new. It's called The Uninvited Guest, and it centers around how our sense of season is changing because of climate change And
Yeah.
that affects how we craft our rituals. Like, how do we call in space when summer isn't summer anymore? Winter isn't
Yeah.
winter anymore? Are we calling on the memories of what we remember it to be? And how do those memories factor into, the manifestation or whatever prayer we're offering? How does that change our space, like when we call it in? That's a
Yeah.
lab. The uninvited guest is a lab to address that issue of how we call in our space when our experience of season and maybe even kind of sort of direction is not what it used to be, and it's not going to land. It's still going to be in motion for a while. How does that affect your rituals? That's the uninvited guest, which I'm going to do sometime later this fall, but there is a wait list for that, and there's a wait list for the Quest series on my website if people want to be notified when those details become available. Thank you for asking that.
Well, Kelley, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you and ask you the questions I had. So many of them are ones that are on my mind. And so thank you for working with us through those questions. I want to tell people that we have links to your website on the show notes and also to your book, From Elder to Ancestor. They can purchase that through the links. Kelley, thank you for being on the podcast. I've enjoyed talking to you very much.
Thank you for having me, Dean. I really appreciate it.
And that wraps up my conversation with the incredible Kelley Harrell. Remember, you can find her new book, From Elder to Ancestor, Nature Kinship for All Seasons of Life, available for purchase now through the link in the bio. You can learn more about Kelley and her work with Soul Intent Arts. Head over to the show notes. Thanks for joining us and Calling the Quarters. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review to help others find the show. Until next time, may you be blessed.